A frightening encounter with demons in the Bible, real or myth? 1. The Bible's terrifying accounts of demons, eyewitness testimony or ancient legend. Across the misted landscapes of ancient Palestine, where the dust hung in the air like the breath of forgotten spirits, there survives a record, raw, jagged, and chilling in its unfiltered terror. The Bible, that ancient and blood-soaked testament to human frailty and divine mystery, does not whisper about demons. It screams. It bleeds their existence across its pages with a terrifying candor. Voices that shriek from ruined throats, bodies that writhe under invisible assaults. Human dignity shredded until nothing remains but madness and exile. These are not the neatly domesticated demons of modern imagination. They are feral, volcanic, and real. Nowhere does this terror condense more fully, more horrifically, than in the account of the Gerasene demoniac. In the Gospel of Mark chapter 5, we are dragged into a confrontation with something so saturated with horror that even the bones of the reader seem to ache beneath its weight. Here is no vague mythic archetype. Here is a man, nameless, broken, who lived among the tombs, that haunted threshold where life and death commingle. He was so violent that no chain, no iron fetter could contain him. He shattered them as if human craftsmanship were an insult to his fury. Night and day among the desolate hills he screamed, an endless, hollowed cry that must have sounded more beast than man. His flesh bore the scars of his torment. He gashed himself with stones, his blood crying out from the ground like the blood of Abel. And then, history shudders. Eternity holds its breath. Jesus steps ashore. The man, or rather the thing that had colonized him, collapses at the feet of Christ. And the words that spill forth are not the disjointed stammerings of madness, but the lucid, venomous plea of something ancient. "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." Here lies the chilling clarity. Here lies the unveiling. An entity that recognizes divinity, that cowers before it, and that speaks from within the hollowed ruin of a man. There is no parable here, no soft metaphor. This is brute testimony, the cry of one who has seen the terrible scaffolding behind the stage of human existence. Philosophy demands we pause here. It demands that we ask, as Socrates once did, whether our assumptions blind us to realities too vast and too violent for our sheltered frameworks. If we are honest, brutally, surgically honest, we must confront an unbearable possibility that the early Christians were not crafting moral fables to fill idle hours. They were recording terror as they had lived it. They wrote not as detached myth-makers weaving abstractions, but as eyewitnesses trembling under the vast, dark wings of a reality too savage to be domesticated. To dismiss these accounts as mere legend is, in effect, to accuse the witnesses of either madness or deception, yet the narratives resist such accusations. They are not the loose, airy stuff of mythology. They are tethered, naming villages, describing landscapes, involving multiple observers. The man among the tombs was no secret shame whispered among a few. He was known. He was seen. His madness was public, and his deliverance was public. It was witnessed by townspeople who, upon hearing the tale, begged Jesus to leave, too terrified to allow the seam between the seen and the unseen to be torn open further. This is not the cadence of myth. This is the cadence of reporting. It thrums with the raw, panicked breath of those who have seen the mask of reality slip and who have not yet recovered from the sight. True legends, after all, grow slowly. They accrete over centuries like coral over the bones of forgotten sailors. But the gospel writers record these events as immediate, burning, and recent, as if the ink of terror had scarcely dried upon the page. One must ask, then, if even a sliver of their testimony is true, what does it demand of us? It demands that we abandon the cozy illusion that demons are relics of a primitive past. It demands that we surrender the sterile arrogance of modernity, which sneers at the supernatural as a childish superstition. For if the witnesses spoke truly, even a little, then the horror that walked among them walks still. It prowls not only the hills of Gerasene, but the asphalt arteries of our cities. It haunts not only the tombs, but the corridors of our institutions. It lurks not only among the broken, but perhaps within the manicured despair of our own hearts. Skepticism, of course, rises like a tidal wave, armed with the sharpened blades of science and psychology. It seeks to slice these testimonies into clean, explainable pieces. Mental illness, epileptic seizures, mass hysteria, all are called forth to wrap the raw terror in the gauze of understanding. Yet skepticism itself must be interrogated, for when it hardens into reflexive dismissal, it ceases to be a servant of reason and becomes its assassin. As Blaise Pascal warned, the devil's greatest triumph may be convincing the world that he does not exist. In our refusal to consider the unseen, we may already be conquered by it. Indeed, Scripture repeatedly warns that evil does not always wear the rags of the grotesque. It masquerades as wisdom, as enlightenment, as progress. It deceives not merely the simple, but also the sophisticated. It does not merely haunt the broken, but often speaks through those crowned with influence and clothed in honor. The Gerasene demoniac was unmistakable in his torment. But what of the demon who walks in polished shoes, who smiles with perfect teeth, who whispers in councils and classrooms and courts? The question, then, is not whether demons once walked among men. The question, the agonizing, world-shaking question, is whether they ever left. Perhaps the ancient witnesses, those trembling chroniclers who watched a broken man fall at the feet of the Son of God, knew something we have forgotten, that to deny evil is not to vanquish it, but to be devoured by it, that to mock the existence of demons is not to build walls against them, but to tear those walls down with our own hands, that disbelief is not armor, it is an open wound. And so the record remains. It breathes still from the torn pages of Scripture. It cries out from the tombs and the hills, from the broken bodies and shattered minds of every generation. It waits, not passively, but hungrily, for us to decide whether we will believe and awaken, or whether we will laugh and be consumed. 2. Demons in the Bible had power over minds and bodies. The demons of Scripture were not delicate phantoms that crept timidly into dreams. They were ravenous invaders who devoured minds, wrecked bodies, and erased identities until nothing human remained but a hollow shell. They did not merely frighten, they dismantled the very architecture of the soul. In the ancient world, men understood disease, crudely perhaps, but with enough clarity to distinguish the ordinary from the extraordinary. A fever could be explained, a broken limb could be set, even plagues, monstrous though they were, unfolded according to grim but familiar patterns. Yet there were sufferings that bore a darker signature, blindness that descended not from accident but from malevolent will, madness that was not the product of injury but of something invisible gnawing at the mind, seizures that struck not as mechanical spasms but as assaults, deliberate and cruel, as if some unseen predator toyed with its prey. Violence, too, erupted, not as the calculated rage of men, but as spasmodic eruptions of chaos, acts without motive or reason. These were not mere malfunctions of flesh. They were footprints, dark impressions left behind by entities that moved with intelligence, purpose, and a hatred for the image of God impressed upon humankind. Nor does one need to search deeply into Scripture to find such haunting realities. Consider the boy in Mark 9:17-29, a child whose earliest years were not marked by the laughter of innocence, but by the gnashing teeth of invisible torment. A spirit, the Scriptures reveal, seized him from his youth, hurling him into fires, dashing him into waters, always mauling, always striving to destroy, yet never quite succeeding. It gnawed at him like a beast, but with a cruelty that transcended mere animal instinct. It seemed to savor his continued suffering, to revel in the slow mutilation of his body and mind. Here in this trembling child gasping for breath between episodes of unimaginable violence, we encounter not random cruelty, but the calculated malice of a spiritual adversary. His body was not merely ill, it was besieged. His mind was not simply troubled, it was occupied territory. And yet, how different truly is that from what we see today? We live in an age that prides itself on enlightenment, and yet we witness an epidemic of mental breakdowns that no pharmacology can fully explain. An avalanche of suicides, addictions, compulsions, and terrors that psychology can barely describe, let alone heal. We see unexplainable violence erupt in places meant for peace, schools, churches, marketplaces, as if some unseen hand had reached into the hearts of men and turned them into weapons against their own kind. We see senseless destruction, acts of ruin that seem to move through individuals and crowds with a momentum all their own, as if invisible strings were being pulled by puppeteers beyond our sight. And we, desperate to remain rational, invent new names, new disorders, new diagnoses. Yet every new term rings hollow beside the ancient, ragged scream of a tormented soul. Could it be, horrifying as it is to consider, that the ancient enemies have not disappeared at all? Could it be that they have merely adapted, shedding their coarse skins to blend into the sterile language of modern science? That what once spoke through foaming mouths and shuddering limbs now speaks through clinical charts and psychiatric evaluations, still dismantling lives, still devouring souls, but hidden behind the polished veneers of medicine and respectability? It is a chilling possibility, yet if we read Scripture with sober eyes, it does not suggest that demons retired after the first century, like soldiers departing from a finished war. On the contrary, it warns, with a voice sharpened by urgency, that the powers of darkness would grow more cunning, that they would embed themselves more deeply into civilization itself, so deeply, in fact, that the world would no longer recognize them even as it was being devoured. The Apostle Paul did not describe spiritual warfare as a quaint metaphor for private morality. He spoke of a brutal, unrelenting conflict against principalities and powers, forces that infest not only individuals but systems, economies, governments, and even religious institutions. Christ himself warned that in the last days, evil would masquerade so convincingly as righteousness that even the elect might be deceived. Deception would be the signature of the final age. Not open terror, but the subtle, almost beautiful lie, the poison disguised as medicine, the abyss hidden behind the smiling mask of progress. In such an age, the demons would not shriek from caves. They would speak from podiums, from laboratories, from screens. And their greatest triumph would be that no one believed they existed at all. Thus, if demons were real then, they are real now. Their appetite for destruction has not lessened. Their tactics have simply evolved. No longer needing to provoke mass possessions to terrify a village, they now whisper despair into isolated hearts, sowing loneliness, rage, nihilism, while we congratulate ourselves for being too advanced to believe in them. If once they shattered minds and bodies with visible violence, they now shatter invisibly, through ideologies that corrode the soul, through entertainments that dull the spirit, through technologies that promise liberation while binding the will with chains unseen but stronger than iron. And we, proud heirs of an age that worships only the visible and mocks the invisible, remain at risk, perhaps more so than any generation before us. For we have discarded not only the old rituals, but the old vigilance. We have laughed at the sentries who once kept watch at the soul's gates. We have thrown wide the doors and dared darkness to enter, certain in our delusion that it does not exist. Yet the ancient enemy is patient. It does not need to be seen to conquer. It needs only to be denied. It needs only for us to call its victories by other names. In the end, the battle is not between faith and superstition. It is between seeing and blindness, between naming the enemy and pretending it never was, between standing armed at the threshold of the soul or falling quietly into the waiting jaws of an adversary who has never forgotten us, even as we have forgotten him. 3. The Church's hidden war against demons. Behind the thick, silent walls of ancient basilicas, behind the towering cathedrals with their vaulted ceilings and smoky rituals of incense, beyond the gleaming altars and the majestic choirs, there existed another church, a hidden church, not draped in velvet and gold, but soaked in sweat, blood, and terror. It was a church that did not wage war through papal decrees or ecumenical councils. It fought with weapons forged in the unseen realms, prayers sharpened into blades, fasting that tore at the body to strengthen the spirit. and exorcisms that were not the sanitized performances of modern imagination, but brutal confrontations where life and death hung by a thread. The war against demons was not discussed with polite detachment in seminaries. It was screamed in midnight exorcisms, groaned in desperate prayers, and wept in the shattered voices of the tormented, who clutched the altars not for symbolism, but for survival. Early Christians knew demons were real, not as abstract symbols of evil, not as primitive metaphors for psychological imbalance, but as tangible, malevolent beings that bled into their reality with devastating effect. They knew demons because they fought them, not in theory, but face to face, hour after agonizing hour. Exorcisms were not grand theatrical displays for the curiosity of the faithful. They were battles, raw, violent, sometimes fatal. A priest did not merely sprinkle water and mutter Latin phrases over a home. He entered as a warrior into a space where the very walls seemed to breathe malice, where furniture shook with unseen rage, where voices answered back from the shadows. And those voices were not human. Homes were not merely cleansed. They were seized back from monsters clawing at the very souls of those who lived within. Yet somewhere, along the long and blood-soaked road of Christian history, the church changed. It did not change suddenly with banners and proclamations. It changed quietly, stealthily, like a river eroding its own banks without a sound. Exorcisms, once commonplace and urgent, became rarities tucked into the forgotten corners of ecclesiastical practice. Talk of demons, once central to understanding the invisible war for souls, became an embarrassment, an uncomfortable relic of medieval superstition. Rising like a silent tide, there grew a new doctrine, a far more dangerous heresy than any external threat: the doctrine of denial. It whispered from pulpits that evil could be explained away with psychology. It nodded behind clerical collars that possession was a misunderstanding. It clothed itself in the language of the enlightened and the modern, while abandoning the ancient battleground without a fight. Why did this happen? The answer, though terrifying, is not difficult to see. For to acknowledge demons is to acknowledge a world the modern church no longer dares to touch. A world not ruled by polished theology, not contained within tidy psychological theories, but wild, brutal, and uncontrollable. A world where Satan does not lurk in allegory, but laughs aloud at the pretensions of scholars. A world where evil wears teeth and claws, and seminary walls cannot muffle the howls of the damned. To speak of demons today is to confess that the church is still at war, and war is messy, bloody, unrespectable. A church desperate to be accepted by academies and parliaments feared ridicule more than it feared the devil. It feared the sting of mockery more than the teeth of hell. And so, craving respectability above reality, it chose silence over truth. Deep within the Vatican itself, where centuries of secrets slumber beneath marble floors and within forbidden archives, rumors swirl like mist over a battlefield. There are whispers of sealed documents, not quaint curiosities but grim records. Testimonies of exorcisms so violent that priests themselves were left broken in mind and body. Accounts where the possessed spoke languages they had never learned, displayed strength no man should possess, revealed knowledge they could not have known. Archives stacked high with evidence of a war that has never ended. Evidence hidden, because to reveal it would shatter the fragile illusion that demons belong to an ignorant past. Experts, those few courageous enough to speak, argue that the church's retreat from demonology was not theological at all. It was political, born not from deeper understanding, but from deeper fear. The council halls did not thunder with a decree announcing that demons no longer mattered. Instead, quiet decisions were made. Protocols were rewritten. Exorcism ministries were starved of support. Demonology was quietly excised from seminarian training. It was not merely a betrayal of doctrine, it was a betrayal of the battlefield itself. For by pretending demons no longer exist, the church disarmed its sentries, laid down its sword, and opened the gates to an enemy that had never retreated. In that silence, demons moved like smoke through the cracks. They entered churches, they stood behind pulpits, they whispered into the ears of bishops, they sang in choirs and presided over councils. They wore the stolen garments of piety while sowing chaos with invisible hands. This is the hidden war they do not tell you about. A war still raging, more vicious now precisely because it is fought in darkness, denied by those who should have been its fiercest defenders. The battlefield is no longer marked only by the screams of the possessed. It stretches into the quiet despair of the faithful who sense, without being told, that something vital has been abandoned. It stretches into institutions hollowed out from within, into families shattered without cause, into the tidal wave of suicidal despair sweeping through a world that claims to be enlightened. The demons have not been defeated by human progress. They have simply been left unopposed by a church too sophisticated to believe in the war it was born to fight. Thus, the choice laid before us is terrible in its simplicity. Either awaken to the war raging behind the veil, or continue to sleep and be devoured. Either take up again the ancient weapons, sharpened by prayer and fasting, or lay them aside in favor of theories that demons mock. Either confront the buried truths hidden beneath cathedrals and councils, or allow the silent tide of denial to drag yet another generation into the abyss. For the demons have not grown weaker, only the watchmen have grown silent. 4. Real or myth? Why denying demons could be the devil's greatest trick. Imagine an enemy so insidiously cunning that it wages its greatest war not by overt attack, but by erasing itself from your mind. Imagine a predator so sophisticated that as it tears at your throat, it whispers soothingly, "There is nothing to fear," and you, believing it, smile even as you bleed. If demons are real, and the Bible insists without hesitation that they are, then their most decisive victory is not the dramatic possession of bodies, it is the quieter, infinitely deadlier possession of disbelief. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, with chilling precision, warned that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And in that brief statement lies a catastrophe still unfolding. Scripture does not contradict him, rather it agrees with almost desperate urgency. Paul, in 2 Corinthians 11:14, declares that Satan disguises himself not in hideousness, but in radiance, masquerading as an angel of light, nesting not in the dark corners of terror, but in the warm, respected spaces of beauty, intellect, and false righteousness. In 1 Peter 5:8, believers are commanded not to relax but to remain fiercely alert, for the devil prowls like a roaring lion, not a distant myth but an immediate, ravenous threat. The book of Revelation paints an even more terrifying end, a world where demonic deception reaches its grotesque crescendo, where false prophets perform false miracles and offer false safety, where the ultimate trap is sprung upon a generation too proud, too wise in its own eyes to believe it could ever be fooled. In this final unveiling, evil will not come as a caricature. It will come clothed in everything the world worships: progress, peace, wisdom, until the very elect are at risk of bowing before a God they mistake for good. Thus, to laugh at the ancient warnings, to dismiss demons as relics of a pre-scientific age, is not an intellectual triumph. It is to walk blindfolded into their jaws. It is to become easy prey, not despite our learning, but precisely because of it. We dance at the lip of the abyss, mistaking it for a meadow. We mistake the chill of the grave for the kiss of a harmless breeze. We mock the sentinels who cried alarm, forgetting that it is not wisdom but folly to sneer at a guard who tries to rouse a sleeping city before the gates are breached. The harsh but inevitable verdict is this: the modern world scoffs at demons because it has been meticulously trained by an era that exalts reason above revelation. It worships what it can measure and despises what it cannot, believing that to deny the unseen is to master it. Yet in mocking the ancient witnesses, in dismissing their terror as childish superstition, we have flung open the gates to an invisible slaughter. We have traded vigilance for vanity, traded fear of the devil for fear of ridicule. The Bible does not offer us soothing myths wrapped in the soft gauze of metaphorical comfort. It offers us a battlefield, raw and bloodied. It offers a sword placed squarely in our trembling hands, and a choice as sharp as the blade itself. Believe and fight for your soul, or deny and fall. quietly, elegantly, into the waiting mouth of an enemy who never needed to be seen to be victorious.